Welcome back to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host, as always, Jed Lea-Henry. And on today's show, we have the author of the book, Monuments of Power, the North Korean Origin of Nationalist Monuments in Namibia and Zimbabwe, and also a PhD candidate of African Studies at the Centre Leiden at Leiden University. And this is Tycho van der Hoog. Tycho, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So today we're going to speak about this book of yours and, of course, your ongoing research, which is this wonderful cross-section between North Korea and Africa, which many people might struggle to first picture where it's going to be. So I might start where your book first starts, with this remarkable moment in, I believe it's 2015, and you're in Namibia doing research on the history of beer brewing, I believe. And then you bump into this North Korean statue. So as a first question, how did that come about, and how did you find yourself in this particular avenue of research?
It really was a coincidence. I don't consider myself a Korean studies specialist in any way. Like you said, I arrived in Namibia in 2015 for research on a very different topic, the history of beer, which is just it's a great topic to work on, but doesn't have anything to do with North Korea. And on my first day, I wandered through the streets of Windhoek, which is the capital city. And I suddenly stumbled upon this grand North Korean monument, which was called the coffee pot by the locals because it had such a peculiar shape, and it was this bronze, almost golden color. And people told me it was built by North Korea very recently. It opened its doors in 2014, and I couldn't believe it. Also because it turned out to be the National National Museum of History. So it was an African history told through North Korean visual methods and built by North Korean laborers. And this experience really stuck with me. So when I came back, I came back to Leiden. I wrote up my thesis, and then I said to my supervisor, this is something that I need to do next. And that's how the book came about, really.
And I imagine one of the large challenges you have, which you do mention at the start of your book, is about sources. So,
Definitely.
Of course, you mentioned how useful the Asian library at Leiden University was, and how useful that was. But it seems to become very quickly apparent that you have to get on the ground, and you have to deal a lot with personal interaction.
I do believe that, yeah, and I also think that the repositories in Africa are overlooked, and it's logical in a way because those repositories are often quite hard in some cases to access. You have to know they exist. You have to know your way around them, but they do hold some just astonishing collections, really. Also relevant for Korean studies, and that's really what I found out when I went back to Namibia and also to Zimbabwe for the research for this book, is that I worked in these African archives, and I found incredible material for Korean studies.
How well documented are these sites that you mention here? Is there any effort that you see here to cover any of this up or to fudge it over, or is it all very well documented, like you might have hoped for?
Oh, people know definitely that there are North Korean statues. Some of them, they have these you can kind of tour around them by government officials. And they will proudly tell you that it was built by North Korean laborers, and that the inspiration is indeed taken from North Korea. So no one's really trying to hush that up, which was also a bit surprising to me, because when I arrived in Namibia and I saw the coffee pot for the first time, I had a very different image of North Korea in my mind. Like I said, I hardly knew anything about the country, but I did have this image of the DPRK as a hermit kingdom, this closed-off society led by some madman with hardly any interaction with the rest of the world. So to see a large and also visible presence in Southern Africa was truly surprising.
And from that, you said that instinct many people have about North Korea, about this, it's a slightly dangerous country to get involved in. I'm wondering how you went about your field work on the ground. Did you have any challenges of getting people to open up and to speak with you about these sources based on? I mean, you write here that it was only in 2016 when the United Nations warned African countries about violating international sanctions with the United Nations, and there's a lot of there must be a lot of trepidation these days amongst these people. So, how was the field work? I suppose is my question. Was it tricky?
It was in some respects. The North Korean monuments are, like I said, very visible and people know their background. But if you want to dig deeper and you want to look at the relationship between the ruling parties and the North Korean regime, which is ultimately the topic really also of my PhD thesis that I'm working on, that is very sensitive, especially because the United Nations, like you said, in 2016 have been pushing African countries because they are violating sanctions. So in terms of talking to people, it became difficult. People recognized it was a sensitive topic, didn't like to talk about it that much. And also in terms of archival research, I will find files that are not accessible, for instance, that I can't get my hands on. So that made it a little bit difficult.
But you did write that it was somewhat easier in Namibia than it was in Zimbabwe. So why was that?
That really had to do with the situation in Zimbabwe. It was right at the moment that Mugabe was still in office, shortly before he was ousted by Mnangagwa. The situation was just really, really tense. Zimbabwe in the past 20 years at least have been going down the drains, to be perfectly honest, and it makes sense that it also reflects on your the ability to do research. I mean, if people have to survive, so there is, I think, less space for historical research in a way that I could do in Namibia or in Zambia or South Africa.
So throughout your book here, you build up this wonderful picture of how we can slowly begin to explain how these monuments ended up there. And a lot of it digs into the history of the African continent itself. So let's go there. And of course, you are a historian by training. And of course, you began this, as you said, as a historian of focused on Africa. So let's start there with this, with the academic discipline. And you speak about, I believe, 3 phases of of research that's been done on Africa, these traditional 3 phases. And the first phase is from the 1950s to the 1980s and consists of nationalist studies. So let's take us there to those early days of African studies and what that consisted of.
Well, African studies, and especially African history, is a very young discipline. And that's all related to the history of colonialism. When the European colonizers arrived in the African continent, they firmly believed that there was no history in Africa. They thought it was a timeless continent where people just had been living with the seasons for ages, basically. Only at the cusp of independence in the 1950s, 1960s, this really started to change. And then I think in the 1950s, the first professorship in African history was founded in England. And from then on, the discipline really emerged, but it was strongly aligned with the liberation of Africa. So suddenly people started to write histories of African nations, but those histories were extremely nationalist in nature. So people would write the history of Zambia, or they would write the history of Nigeria, for instance. And it's a very theological way of writing history, I would say. And only later people started to become critical of this nationalist history. And I think we're now only just now starting to get to the point where we can look truly critical at what has happened and start to write, well, people would say like transnational histories instead of these very narrowly defined stories.
And one of the really interesting things from reading your book, for someone like me who has no real feel for African history in that deep academic sense, was a couple of your explanations and your looks at how other people have seen the continent and have seen historical research and how they've gone about it. And that question of nationalism becomes so important here and so important for explaining this wave. And it seems to be this deep fusion between liberation movements and national identity.
Definitely, yeah. You have to realize that these liberation movements, they emerged in exile because they were not allowed to build their organizations in the countries that we're trying to liberate. And in exile, which was often, for instance, the UK or the United States of America, these people were also educated at American and European universities. And the subject they often took was history. And it was at these universities that they really developed a sense of history and the power of history for the liberation movements. I name one example in my book, which is a book called To Be Born a Nation, which was written by Peter Katjavivi. He was a member of SWAPO, and SWAPO was the main liberation movement of Namibia. And To Be Born a Nation was basically their version of how Namibia emerged as a country. And this was done before independence. And the book really became this blueprint for how people viewed the history of Namibia.
So we're touching here on that second and third wave as well, which we might touch on now before we move into some of the really fascinating details here. And one of the things that does come through when you talk about, I believe it's the second and the third wave in this reinterpretation, you talk about how a lot of this, particularly Southern African history, has been molded into a model and a way in which you don't just build a nation through the history, but legitimize rule in certain ways. So I might get to touch on that question of how African history has, in Southern Africa, has been, as you write there, molded into a usable model for legitimation of power and nation building, I'm quoting.
I once read somewhere that in the War for Liberation, history is the very first conscript. And I think that's a very powerful explanation. Like I said, these liberation movements really relied on a common history, on a nationalist history to mobilize the masses, because they were always divided by the colonizers or the white settlers. So they needed this unifying story to, rally everyone behind their cause. And when they finally succeeded and they gained independence, history became a tool to legitimize their rule. In Southern Africa, almost the entire region today is ruled by former liberation movements. These are organizations that emerged from these guerrilla-type movements, and they rely on their struggle credentials, as they say, to argue that they are destined for power. You can look today at Angola and Namibia, South Africa, Botswana, Mozambique, Zimbabwe. These are all countries that are firmly ruled by former liberation movements, and they legitimize this by saying, look, we are the ones that liberated the country, so we are the only ones that know how to responsibly govern the country.
So let's step back into the National Heroes Monument in Accra, and this, as you say, is in the capital city, I believe, and you describe it in rich detail here through your book. So, just for people listening, what exactly does it look like? It sounds through your writing to be an absolutely huge site.
It is. When I talk about North Korean monuments or statues, it would be wrong to think of like a small statue somewhere tucked in a idyllic place in the city. No, I take the National Heroes Acre of Namibia as an example, which is built just outside the city of Windhoek, the capital city of Namibia. And then you drive out of the city into the mountains, and then you enter a gate, and it's this huge complex, which is basically a cemetery for the national heroes. And one of the first things that you'll see is some sort of staircase that can hold 5,000 people. And these stairs are often filled to the max because they're being used for national celebrations and state funerals and that sort of thing. And then when you sit down, you look at a statue, a very, very North Korean military, masculine, golden statue. And then at the very end of the statue is an obelisk, which is a very important part. And then on the left and the right are around 170 graves. And this is the most sacred place of Namibia, you could say, because only true national heroes, or at least in the mythology of the ruling party, are allowed to be buried there. So it's meant to impress, and I think it does.
And it also is a central to this site. Also seems to be the leader, of course. I'm going to pronounce the name wrong here. Sam Nujoma.
Yes.
Sam Nujoma. Yeah. So he seems to not just be pictured in some of the iconography, but also there's mention of him and how he first conceived it, apparently at an Organization of African Unity summit in Harare in 1977. So the whole history of it seems to come back to him as well and his central place in this.
Exactly. It's officially the National Heroes Acre of Namibia, but I guess you could also call it the National Heroes Acre of SWAPO, which is the liberation movement and today the governing party. At the center is this statue of the unknown soldier, but the face of the unknown soldier resembles Sam Nujoma very strongly. And Nujoma was at close personal ties with Kim Il-sung. He visited Pyongyang numerous times, and SWAPO was supported by North Korea. So that's an explanation for the way that the statue is set up, or the whole cemetery in that case. But what I found really interesting is that, like what you already hinted at, is this monument is in fact a copy of National Heroes Acre of Zimbabwe in Harare. And Nujoma, he traveled with some other SWAPO officials to Harare. He saw the cemetery and he said to his aides, I want to have this in Namibia. So they basically phoned North Korea and said, can you do for us what you did for Zimbabwe?
So if the one in Namibia is a copy of Zimbabwe, they are both a copy of the one in Pyongyang, it seems. So how similar are they? Are they just elements that certain artistic elements, or when you see them, is it unmistakable?
It's unmistakable. The layout is the same. The one in Pyongyang, the Revolutionary Martyrs Cemetery, it has the same setup. So again, there are these around 170 graves. There's the obelisk. There's the statue. There are all these different elements that I mentioned, and some more that I mentioned in the book that are the same. And that's why I took this approach in my book, because you can trace the National Heroes Acre of Namibia back to the one in Zimbabwe, and then back to the one in Pyongyang. And then you can lay them all next to each other, and they are all visibly the same. And you wouldn't easily say, well, that one is African, that one is Korean, or that one is Zimbabwean, for instance. The one difference that I found, which is just a very interesting historical detail, is that the one in Zimbabwe, if you look at it from the top, from a helicopter view, it has the shape of two Kalashnikovs that lay next to each other. And then the bullets in a Kalashnikov are the individual graves. And this is really has something to do with the peculiar history of Zimbabwe and North Korea, where they gifted also the AK-47s to the liberation movement.
And they also, and is it, I'm from your book here, you write, I'm going to put it here, I'm going to quote you, more importantly, besides physical features, the sites share the same goal, a specific politicization of history, legitimizing the prevailing regime. So we did mention, of course, the one, and we spoke about this, of course, Africa in general, Southern Africa and Namibia, but all three sites, including the one back in North Korea, all have the same purpose.
They do. They legitimize the rule for the governing party, and they mean to rule indefinitely. SWAPO does not want to give up power. ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe is obviously the same. They have been ruling since independence, and this is something I believe where they can find inspiration in North Korea, despite the fact that those countries are completely different. They are being ruled by a movement, at least in their own mythology. They believe that they have liberated the peoples from the shackles of colonialism, and they deserve to be the winners.
So let's talk about why these statues all look the same, and importantly, the question must come of why Pyongyang looks the way it does, and that's because all the landscape, of course, North Korea was razed to the ground almost entirely during the Korean War. So the country built itself up from the bottom up under Kim Il-sung and then the two Kims after him. And all this building, all this construction of the country and the personality cults happened under one single art institute, and this is the Mansu Day Art Institute. And it's important to mention because, of course, this is the art institute that built the two in Namibia and Zimbabwe. But you write they're not just responsible for these two. You mentioned countries. I'm going to quote them here: Angola, Botswana, Benin, Ethiopia, Equatorial Guinea, Senegal, Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, Chad, Mali, Mozambique, Madagascar, and Togo. And that's a huge influence that this one art studio seems to have building across the African continent.
It's incredible, and they build all sorts of things, not only these cemeteries, but also museums and stadiums and state houses for presidents, and you name it, and they will build it for you if you pay with hard foreign currency, that is.
Let's get into some of the things that you push back on a little bit. This is where it becomes really fascinating, this history. So I might put in some of the ways in which people have explained this in the past. And the first one seems to be, and you're right, it's an explanation that can be found in the fact that African countries do not possess the expertise to develop the desired war memorials. So I might get to touch on this as something that a lot of people fall back on when they look at these monuments, and they originally look for a reason why they must be there. And you're right, the first one that it seems to be is the idea that the African countries simply don't have the expertise to do it themselves.
Yes, I think these statues are misunderstood. When the one in Namibia was being built, the local architects rallied together and they wrote a letter lamenting the government for tendering the project to North Korea, because they said, well, we can do it. We can probably do it better and cheaper, and would improve the local labor. So I don't agree with this superficial idea that there is no local expertise.
What about the second one? So I'll run through them here. The second one is that they're cheap. And of course, it's another, as you write, something that you push back on, but another claim that North Korean labor, North Korean manufacturing is cheaper.
Yeah, they are never cheap, because the projects that I've come across, at least, they're all twice or three times as expensive in the end as they're promised at the beginning, and they're also not tendered in an open process. So it's all very hush-hush, and then at the end of the road, it turns out to be much more expensive than was promised beforehand. So that's also something that I think it's easy to say, but it doesn't hold up.
And the third one, which again you think doesn't hold up here, and you're right in detail, it's the case that African leaders potentially feel attracted to the particular artistic style, which is a kind of a communist, socialist, realist style.
Yeah, and then they will say like, well, these Africans are all dictators, so obviously they like this very extravagant communist kind of visual style. But I think that's too easy, because it's not really about the individual persons. It's not about Sam Nujoma or Robert Mugabe or any of these other presidents that I do agree are very authoritarian in some ways. What I think is the core is the liberation movement. That's also what I'm focusing on in the book and in my current PhD project. It's something that I believe is overlooked in the literature. It's the importance of a liberation movement that has turned itself into the governing elite and wants to rule indefinitely.
So let's actually jump into that then. This question of what you believe that it is, and what comes out really strongly here in the research. So a lot of people may say they recognize similarities, perhaps between Zimbabwe and Namibia, between some of the debates and the things that they have, some of the history that people look into there, but. They may say, what is the similarity with North Korea? So I suppose the question there is, what is the North Korean history of its liberation movement?
I think that the core of this is the end of the Korean War in 1953. The Korean War, when it ended, it reinforced the stalemate between the North and the South, and both countries on each side of the peninsula realized that they needed the international allies. At this moment, and we're talking about the second half of the 20th century, this was also the golden age of Africa's decolonization. So in a rapid pace, these new independent countries will pop up. They're non-aligned. So this is basically the perfect place to look for new allies. And North and South Korea had very different strategies when it came to Africa. And North Korea really stood apart in a way that they decided to support these national liberation movements in exile long before they became independent. And this choice resulted in strong ties with these movements that are relevant up until today.
So let's again dig into that here, because this is just so fascinating. So how did North Korea begin to build these ties? So as you mentioned there's a huge fight for legitimacy. This is the Cold War, of course, and you have North and South Korea, and they're not too recently liberated from Japan, but of course the country is then divided, and there's American influence in the South and Soviet influence in the North, and there's this battle, it seems, across the world, and particularly in the United Nations, for influence. So how did they go about getting influence in Africa, fighting for these things? Was it simply an alignment of ideas, or was there a certain amount of, was it trade, or was it development gains, or was it grants? How did North Korea go about this?
These national liberation movements basically had two strategies to win power. And that's war and diplomacy. They often tried diplomacy first and then resorted to violence because, just talking didn't get you anywhere. So North Korea offered solutions for both strategies. They offered political support, which was really helpful in the international arena of diplomacy. And they also offered this material support in the sense of military training, military hardware. And they really tried to connect with the national liberation movements on an equal level. This is very important because these diplomats in the African liberation movements, they they sometimes felt humiliated by Western powers, for instance. These Western powers didn't take them seriously. And then comes North Korea along, and they treated these Africans as statesmen in waiting, and these liberation movements as official governments long before independence. And I think that this approach of dealing with each other on an equal basis made an impact.
And importantly, you also write that there's a chance here, you've quoted a few historians that make this claim, that there's a degree of political debt being held in the minds of some African countries, perhaps. So you mentioned this interesting case where South Africa voted against the Human Rights Commission for the United Nations that was there to condemn North Korea. So South Africa voted against that. And there's this interesting question of why they would do that and put themselves out there at this time. And one of the answers perhaps has got to do with this idea of a certain degree of political reciprocity.
I do believe that. One of the debates, I think, is ideology versus strategy. And some people would say that the involvement of North Korea in Southern Africa is motivated by ideology, that they want to spread their idea of Chuche, or that they strongly feel about anti-imperialism, or all this kind of things. I myself am more in favor of the second explanation, which is pragmatism. Basically, I believe that North Korea invested in these liberation movements with the hope that once these movements gained independence, there was some sort of reciprocity. And I think that what we're seeing today with the monuments, but also what you mentioned with the votes in the United Nations, is indeed the paying back, so to say, of the support that they were given during the Cold War. And this is also something that contemporary African leaders would say. They will plainly say that North Korea was a friend before, and that they are vowing to help them out where possible.
So as we build this story up, we should step back in, as a huge explanation for this will be the liberation movement. So let's step into something that a lot of the listeners to this podcast are not going to know about, and this is the particular liberation movements of the countries involved here in Africa. So let's go to Namibia first, and I might get to explain what the history of Namibia and the history of the liberation movement looks like. From, it seems, 1884, this is declared a German protectorate, and then it spirals forward from there. So can you give us a brief history and a history of the liberation movement of Namibia?
Of course, yeah. Namibia was part of what was called Southwest Africa at the time, and it was part of South Africa, which was apartheid at the time. So apartheid was also implemented in Namibia, in Southwest Africa, meaning that white and black people were segregated very, very strongly. What you will see in Namibia is that from the 1960s onward, these liberation movements would pop up. And this is something that you'll see in the entire region. Because in the second half of the 20th century, only Southern Africa was yet to be liberated. Basically, the rest of the continent was already, or at least in large parts, independent. So it was really the last bastion of colonialism and white settler rule. So in Namibia, various liberation movements popped up, and they were obviously not allowed to organize themselves within the country. So they were pushed into exile by the prevailing regime. It was in exile that they developed themselves, that they came in touch with other liberation movements. And this is very important, that they came in touch with other governments and international organizations. And this is also how they connected with North Korea among other countries. And this international diplomacy aspect of it is incredibly important to explain the rise of liberation movements.
I really hope you're enjoying this episode of the podcast, and I apologize for this interruption, but I'm just going to take this moment to remind our listeners that we've made a conscious decision here in the Career Nap podcast not to run advertising in any way. So if you do enjoy the podcast, and you listen regularly, and you do want it to continue, it is important that you do your best to support us at the links below, or by sharing, liking, or commenting on the podcast across social media. All your help in this regard is invaluable. And now back to the episode. And let's, of course, build that out a little bit again. So we're talking, and you mentioned this really interesting part earlier. So I have this image throughout your book. It's a very visual read, which is great. And you are searching for information and you're looking through archives and trying to get access to them. And one of the really important archives that you get your hands on is a private collection. And again, I'm not going to pronounce this name correctly.
You mean Chitendero?
Yes. And of course, you get access to his work and it becomes this vitally important private collection and it's this insight. So what did you gain from this collection and how did you get your hands on it?
So this guy, Mosepane Chitendero, he was a Namibian. And I think that his life story is, he's basically the model for freedom fighters all over the region. So what happened is that he was pushed into exile because he couldn't oppose apartheid in his own country. It was just too repressed. And then he went to Zambia, where he worked for a local radio station. Radio was a very important medium of spreading information and that sort of thing. And then he moved to Tanzania, and this is one of the places. Dar es Salaam at the time, 1960s, 70s, and 80s, was this hub, this Cold War hub, where all of these liberation fighters, journalists, diplomats, artists, they all came together and they explored what they could do to liberate their countries. Then he moved to the US, where he was educated at the American universities, and he even got his PhD, I think. And this is really common for a lot of freedom fighters. And then he came back to Zambia, where he started an institute where exiled Namibians could be educated. This is really important because in their own countries, the African black population had very few opportunities to become educated. It was all part of, colonialism, apartheid style rule. And this is really where they started to build this consciousness of an independent people, of a national people. And then when independence came in 1990, you have to realize that Namibia is a very young country. He became the first speaker of the National Assembly. And then he passed away, I think, in 2006. He was declared a national hero, and he was buried in the National Heroes Acre, the one that we just talked about. But when I found his private archive, his personal papers, it turned out that he had a very large collection of North Korean materials. So there were books and pamphlets, bulletins, these little statements from the North Korean embassy in Windhoek, but also some sort of travel guide to Pyongyang with a map in it. And in the map, the highlights of Pyongyang were circled like you would do if you would visit a new place. And one of the places that he visited probably was the Revolutionary Martyrs Cemetery, the one that formed the model for the cemetery he was buried in when he passed away. So that's really it's incredible story. And the story of Chitendero is I think very similar to many freedom fighters among the region.
And just after, not long after Namibia does take independence, North Korea is very quick to open an embassy up in the capital city in Windhoek. As you said, I believe you said it became independent in 1990. Well, 1991, I believe it is. It's very quickly afterwards, North Korea have an embassy. And of course, actually, it opens in 1990. And this embassy disappears quickly. So what is the story of this embassy in Namibia?
Yeah, that's interesting. Like you say, it disappeared rather quickly, and I could never find out why. But what I did find out is that if you look at the region, at the neighboring countries, it's a bit similar in the sense that there aren't formal embassies operating like we're used to. But that doesn't mean that the North Korean presence in the region has disappeared. What you'll find instead is that Mansu Day, the company, the art studio that develops all of these big monuments, they find an office in Windhoek. And it is my belief that the Mansu Day office is operating as some sort of informal embassy. And I think that's a pattern that you'll see also in the region, where the lines between government and business, if you could say Mansu Day is a business, are blurred. So the normal distinction and the normal view that we have of international relations does not apply in this specific context, I believe.
That is a very interesting parallel there. Someone we both know, Benjamin Young, I did a podcast with him, I guess almost 2 years ago now, and he had this really interesting look about how embassies were going bankrupt across Africa because they were almost left on their own when they came to Africa. They weren't funded from Pyongyang. They ended up there, and they were required then to make their own money. So they're doing all sorts of illicit dealings on the side. And one of the theories that you put forward here for why the embassy disappeared was, in fact, that it failed to pay its bills, very simply.
Oh, I admire Ben's work, and I think he's right. These embassies, at least what we understand of them, is their money making machine. So every year they have to reach some sort of target in terms of money making, and then they start all of these activities. And I found some very innocent examples. So for instance, the embassy in Zambia has to at one point the diplomats working there started fishing, so they could sell or eat some fish that they found. Well, that's very innocent, but there's also evidence that diplomats are abusing their immunity to engage in all sorts of illicit activities. And it is believed, and I agree with that notion, that Africa is a node in North Korean global illicit networks. So you will find all sorts of activities like the smuggling of these rhino horns and manufacturing of cigarettes, selling of methamphetamine, all sorts of bad stuff happening there.
And we'll step into a little bit of that just shortly. But before we do get into that, we should talk about the other side of the coin. So that's Namibia, and a lot of a brief overview of their history and their fight for liberation and the liberation movement. So the other side of the coin is Zimbabwe, or of course, as it was known previously, Rhodesia. This is Great Britain with a colonial power there from 1923. So I might get again from the other side of this, fill in the picture a little bit for us. What was this history of Zimbabwe and the liberation movement within the country?
Zimbabwe was indeed part of the British Empire, was called Southern Rhodesia at the time. And then it suddenly became ruled by white settlers, by the regime of Ian Smith. Ian Smith issued a unilateral Declaration of Independence. And it was really a strange situation. At this point in time, a host of liberation movements had popped up. Most important is ZANU and ZAPU. ZANU was ruled by Robert Mugabe, the famous African dictator, as we know him now. He died quite recently. They were pushed into exile, just like SWAPO, and they actually cooperated with SWAPO and the ANC and all of these other liberation movements quite closely. And then in 1980, they gained independence. In the meantime, they had already forged very close ties to North Korea. North Korea supported them in all kinds of ways. and they continued to do so after independence. And one of the most notorious stories in this sense is, of course, the 5th Brigade.
So before instead of saving that for a little bit later, let's jump into that now, because that was a story that I'd only heard briefly before I bumped into your book, and it's got a fairly notorious history behind it, and also a fairly remarkable present, in the sense that I believe you indicate at some point that it may not have completely disappeared. So what's the history of this 5th Brigade, and what's its status today?
This is one of the darkest pages in Zimbabwean history. Like I said, the liberation history of Zimbabwe is divided basically between these two parties, between ZANU and ZAPU, and they for some point in time they work together, and then they split, and there's all sorts of animosity there. In 1918, Zimbabwe became independent, and Robert Mugabe became the prime minister, later the president, and he had very close ties to North Korea, to Kim Il-sung in particular. And he asked Kim Il-sung if he could help him setting up a personal brigade. At this time, the Zimbabwean army was being trained by Great Britain, and it existed of these 4 brigades. And the North Koreans, they sent around 100 military instructors to set up a 5th brigade, which was completely different from the rest of the army. So it had a different uniform, different communication systems, and it only answered to Robert Mugabe. These North Koreans, they came in, they trained this military force, they gave them weapons like the Kalashnikovs that I mentioned. And then in the 1980s, Mugabe made use of them, and he sent them to Matabeleland, which was the basis of his opposition. And what happened was basically a genocide, which is called the Gukurahundi. And in the Gukurahundi genocide, at least 20,000 people were killed, maybe more. It destroyed the opposition to Robert Mugabe, and especially today, it's an extremely sensitive topic. The wounds have not healed, and it's something that's rarely talked about.
So does this 5th Brigade still exist? I believe it's not formally mentioned, but is there any influence still, or is it something of history now?
We don't know for sure if it's completely abolished. I believe it is. We haven't really heard of them ever since, although there are all sorts of rumors, of course. But one of the things that you'll see is that the current president, Emerson Mnangagwa, his nickname is the Crocodile. He ousted Robert Mugabe quite recently, and then you will think, well, there's a regime change. It's a different government. But Mugabe was the boss of the 5th Brigade, and Mnangagwa was the one who made it possible in practice. He was very closely connected to the development of the 5th Brigade. And even the commander of the 5th Brigade, Perrin Shiri, who was nicknamed Black Jesus because he was convinced he could decide over life and death. He died recently also. But he was also in the cabinet of Mugabe and Mnangagwa, a very important cabinet position. So you will see that people that were involved in the 1980s are in power today. So it is still relevant in that sense.
And we touched on it a little bit already, but there's an important point throughout your research here about when it comes from the North Korean side. And of course, after liberation, North Korea has developed this tract of becoming a nuclear weapons state. And as this has continued, they have had more and more sanctions over the years placed upon them. And they've been harder for them to get their hands not just on foreign currency, but also imports of certain raw materials. And importantly, you write here You quote, I believe it is, Marcus Noland, and you write, and you quote him. He says, North Korea increasingly relies on countries with weak governance to evade sanctions. So I might get a touch on that point about how countries in Southern Africa are incredibly attractive, perhaps, for North Korea based on their weak governance. And also the other side of that coin, really interesting. You write, and this would also explain why Zimbabwe became less attractive to North Korea in recent years due to the collapse of the economy and hyperinflation.
Exactly, yeah. I think that in the 1990s there is an important shift happening within North Korea. When the Soviet Union collapses, the economic assistance of the Soviets to North Korea also disappears, and there's this widespread famine, and North Korea really changes as a country. I believe earning hard foreign currency becomes very important, and this is where Africa really comes in. The monuments are one example. They earn hard foreign currency through the commissioning of these wide range of construction projects that are being executed by North Korean laborers. This is a very important point, because they're not being built by local labor. You already mentioned some of the diplomats that are using their diplomatic immunity to engage in illegal trade. And then there's the weak governance. I didn't mention this in my book, but I recently saw a very interesting report by the Sentry, an American research institute, that looks at these North Korean businessmen in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where they build monuments and they can open bank accounts, and they can deal in US dollars, which is against the sanctions. But because of the weak governance system in the DR Congo, it's not being picked up by, for instance, the banking system. So this is something where steps could be made in terms of the effectiveness of international sanctions.
So in the construction of the two monuments in Namibia and Zimbabwe, did you find anything in those archives, or did you bump into any oral history about North Korean workers involved in those particular sites?
The archives very rarely contain information on this, because it's too recent. I do believe that there must be government material existing, at least, because these are large-scale projects, but they're not being made publicly available, which I regret. But you could, I think oral history, or maybe history, is not exactly the right term, because it's very recent, most of these projects. But just talking to people and open source intelligence in that sense can fill in some of the gaps.
So before we finish here, you finish your book with this wonderful bird's eye view of the historical landscape of how people have viewed Africa and why they misunderstand the North Korean influence here. And you run through a series of historiographies, and you say that these similar developments, you can look at this and look at the history and show why people have made these mistakes, and you highlight a series of points that you think that people have made and are found within the discourses. So I might walk through them one by one, if that's all right. The first one that you focus on is a binary view on history, and you say that these liberation movements, they adopt a binary view on history. A dichotomy between good and bad is essential. So let's touch there first. This one theme that seems to run across both these countries, and this phenomenon of a binary view.
Definitely. These liberation movements are legitimized by their liberation struggle, and they paint this history in the terms of the winners and the losers, the patriots like they are, and the sellouts like basically everyone that they disagree with. And what fascinates me is that this language is very much the same as North Korean propaganda. I've been I've been reading all these North Korean publications, and they really use the same key terms. But the big important thing is that that this binary view of history allows liberation movements to say you are on the wrong side of history, and they will say this especially to opposition parties. They say you weren't there at the moment that it really counted. We were the ones that, we sacrificed our blood to liberate this nation. And in truth, this is a far more complicated picture. The liberation of Africa, all sorts of actors were involved, from students, trade unions, women, different political parties, you name it. But all of these actors are being neglected and brushed aside for the liberation movements. And I think that this is something where they really take inspiration from North Korea.
And the second one we have here is, you call it the Continuity Thesis. And this is this idea that constant references are always being made back to that resistance and to colonization. So even in modern moments and modern challenges, it's this history of colonization and the resistance is constantly brought up and constantly pulled up through references, not just as historical, but through modern day references and analogies.
Exactly. Historians of Africa will, make distinctions between early colonialism, late colonialism, all that sort of stuff. But liberation movements, they claim the earliest resistance against their colonizers from, even in the 19th or 18th century as part of their own liberation movements. I think this is something that, it's not true. When SWAPO, for instance, it was founded in the 1960s, they claim that they were already busy in the 19th century. That's not the case. But for them, it's very important to refer back to this very early instance of local uprisings against colonialism, and that's what I call the continuity thesis.
And there's a focus here. Number 3 now. This is great. This is such a wonderful way to open up the history of this period. The third one that you bring through is this idea of masculinity and violence. And these liberation movements, they weren't non-violent movements. They all rose to power through the long-running and bloody guerrilla wars. And this military mindset remains today.
It is. This is very visible in the monuments, which are very militarist nature, and these statues, they hold grenades in their hands and they wave flags and they have Kalashnikovs at their side. You'll see crashing helicopters on the murals. But it goes beyond the visual aspect. I believe that the military mindset that you mentioned is important in explaining the contemporary behavior of these governments, because they were forged in a time when war was the defining context. That's not the case today, at least in Southern Africa, but they do talk about it in the same sense. The first point that you named about this binary view on history, that's related to this, but they also, you're a traitor if you don't agree with them. These kind of very hierarchical organizations, aggressive polarization. You have to be obedient in this sense. Elections are battles. This is a mindset that's really prevalent throughout the region.
The next one, number 4 here, you write down that the point is family, and you're right, these liberation movements are regarded as families, and this is an ongoing family. And it is remarkable how many of those people central to those guerrilla movements, and not just in Africa, in Southern Africa, but also in North Korea, very obviously, a lot of those central guerrilla fighters, those people who are part of that core movement, they remain there afterwards. They take central positions. It's almost like a certain payback and a loyalty within a family.
It is. All of these presidents are named as the founding fathers of their countries, and the normal citizens are, the sons and daughters of their nations. And it also implies that if you don't agree with the liberation movements, then you're being kicked out of the family, basically. And also this rhetoric, I think, is you will see this in North Korean propaganda, where Kim family are like these guardian parents of the little children that are the North Korean citizens.
There's another one here, and we touched on this, but I'm going to bring it up again here. It is such an important central point here. And we said, and this is point 5, and this is the party as the central actor and the sole role. And the reason I want to bring it up through a quote that you put a little earlier in the book, and this is fairly remarkable for someone like me who didn't know this. So this is the idea that we mentioned a lot, that parties like SWAPO and ZANU-PF, and of course the Central Party in North Korea, bind themselves as the nation itself. And this remarkable point that you reference here. You write, in 1970, SWAPO was designated as, and this is a quote, sole and authentic representative of the Namibian people, end quote. And this designation was by the United Nations General Assembly. So the remarkable influence that these people had in binding the party to the nation stretched well beyond the country itself.
This is very important. SWAPO is a great example of this, but there are also other liberation movements that at some point in time were designated as the authentic representation of their peoples. And the United Nations did this, but also importantly, the Organization of African Unity did this. And the Organization of African Unity had a liberation committee, and the committee basically diverted money and weapons and support to liberation movements. So there was this competition within Southern Africa to be recognized by the Liberation Committee as the authentic representation. SWAPO managed to do this. ZANU managed to do this. Different other liberation movements in different countries. And this is incredibly important because in the history of Namibia, there are many, many other parties' liberation movements, but they were not recognized as such. So they didn't have access to the funds and to the support like their competitors had. And North Korea decided they betted basically on these recognized liberation movements because they felt, these are the ones likely to be in power once independence is gained. And this is true. Yeah, it happened that way.
And the last in this wonderful analysis you have here is point 6, and you're right, this is the Marxist influence. And many people might be scratching their head a little bit. They may understand the early Marxist influence that may have been there in North Korea, even though it may have died out a fair bit. But they may think that they may not have a strong history of their Marxist influence in Southern Africa. But you're right, and once you think of it in these terms, you always hear people talking about each other in terms like comrade this and comrade that. So let's touch on that question, this Marxist influence.
Yeah, I strongly disagree with the notion that these are communist movements. This whole history occurred during the Cold War, and there was this very well-defined polarization between communists and capitalists. I think that a big part of this communist designation was meant to push these movements into a corner, and basically scaremongering in a way. Yes, the rhetoric was Marxist, and it still is. I mean, people in SWAPO still call each other comrades, but they are highly capitalist societies. Even their political programs at the time cannot be called communist at all. So I want to mention that the rhetoric is there, and it can be easily explained by the fact that Western countries did not support liberation movements with weapons, for instance. They refused to do that. So it made sense that these African movements turned east for support, and that they also took over the rhetoric that was important to forge these relations. So that's the way that I mention Marxist influence, but I mean it in a pragmatic way and not in an ideological way. And I think this distinction is often overlooked.
So reading through your book, and do correct me if I'm wrong here, but I get the instinct that perhaps what one of the things that you wish other historians would pay a bit more attention to was a bit, and you have a quote somewhere here which I don't have in front of me at the moment, but it was this idea that too much people tried to pin them down into certain categories and to pin down these leaders and their nationalism into certain categories, and they just didn't spend enough time thinking about the life experiences of these leaders and these central cadre of people and their views on the world. And I suppose in short, that's not enough attention has gone on the actual ideology of these people.
I agree. And this is also where I see the brilliance of Kim Il-sung, because he was such a charismatic leader and he was able to connect with these first generation of African presidents before independence by referring to their shared experience. So they would constantly refer to the fact that they were exiled and that they were imprisoned and that they fought a guerrilla warfare. And I honestly agree that if you look at the history in a critical sense, in the case of North Korea and also in Africa, there is much to say about how this representation of history is not correct, obviously. But it doesn't really matter in the sense that when these people came together, they had a shared framework to look at the world. And these ties that were forged during the Cold War, in exile, during the liberation struggle, these personal ties, I have to say, are for me a big explanation why these movements that are so different, North Korea is so different from Southern Africa, but they still connected in a profound way.
There's a really interesting point. I believe it's about the last page of your book, and when you're ruminating on the thoughts, and this is really interesting here, a really interesting way to look at it, that idea of ideology and this way in which history has become so important to these leaders and these parties. You write, I'm going to quote you here, it's such an interesting way in an interesting way to explain some of the behavior in the countries and some of the, I suppose, lack of change in some ways. So you quote here, the heroes of today are often the villains of tomorrow. Since eternal, and this is another quote, liberators have turned into oppressors, victims into perpetrators. And you go on to say, how different it is today where SWAPO and ZANU-PF have dominated the governments of Zimbabwe and they remain in power. And it got this thing in my head, there hasn't been, because of that history, because the way these countries have attached themselves to history and a certain view of it, that change and that perhaps that moral development hasn't happened in these countries.
I agree. Yeah, they are stuck in time in a way, and a very specific, uncritical representation of history is one of the things that they hold on to power, and it's some ways it's even more important than their physical abilities to control people through the army and the police, because you need this narrative to persuade people that you are the destined ruler. And if I may go back to the very first thing that we talked about in this podcast, is the coffee pot in Windhoek, the first North Korean monument that I saw. As I mentioned, this was the National Museum of History, and it just opened 1 year before I arrived in Namibia at the time. So I was able to visit it when it just opened, and it was incredible because I specialize in African history, Namibian history in particular, and then I enter this North Korean museum that tells a very specific history of an African nation through a North Korean model. And I recognize that it rarely is attached to the historical reality, but it presents a North Korean picture of an African story. So this is, history is very important in forging this unified view on the past and also the future.
As a very last question here, reading through your book, it builds up this clear picture. But for many people that haven't read it, I will link it below, of course, and I do encourage people to go and read it. But for people that haven't, a lot of this focus on history, I found it incredibly illuminating towards the end of your book, and you put this quote in there, and I'm going to read it here. It perhaps sums things up really well in how North Korea and Africa and these Southern African countries, how they fuse together, and how ideology and their behavior begins to make sense. You write, the Heroes Acre is these large sites that you saw in Southern Africa, and the ones that and of course there's correlations from the Mansu Day Art Studio up in Pyongyang. You say they're a form of public history writing. So I might get you to finish on that point. What do you mean by public history writing?
It's a distinction between critical history writing with an academic purpose compared to public history writing, which is meant to mobilize the masses, to present a view of the past which legitimizes these liberation movements, these contemporary governments. I think this distinction is important to make. And this is what we'll see in museums, and what we'll see in these statues and in the stories that people think of to make sense of the world that they live in.
So that's a great place to leave the podcast on. As I just mentioned, I am going to link Tycho's book below. And again, I can't encourage people to go and read it enough themselves. It is absolutely fascinating read. And again, it's full of images. You can go and see these monuments as well, but also the writing is incredibly visual. It'll take you there and begin to really open up this picture for you. So please go and read it. You will not be disappointed. On that, Tycho van der Hoog, thanks for coming on the Korean Art Podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. This is just a final reminder that we've made a conscious decision here on the Korean Art Podcast not to run advertising. And so the podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you do want it to continue, please consider supporting the podcast at the PayPal or Patreon links attached below. Or importantly, you can share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media. And on that, I hope to see you again for the next episode. Thanks again for listening.